Dr. Stephen Barr, thanks so much for being here. It's a real honor to have you on our campus and grateful for your presence and for your gifts. Steve, why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, thanks for having me here. It's been the second time I visited and I'm enjoying myself. So I'm a theoretical physicist by profession, though I retired 2 years ago from a relatively long career doing research in particle physics. And I'm a cradle Catholic. And I have a sort of second career in addition to being a research scientist, and that is to speak and write about science and faith and their relationship. And about 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, a group of scientists, friends of mine, and I started something called the Society of Catholic Scientists, of which you are a member. And from 6, we've grown in 6 years, or a little bit less than 6 years, to 1,700 members, and that's why I retired 2 years ago, to spend all my time running that organization.
I've personally benefited from many of your writings over the years, especially a lot of your articles and first things you've written so wonderfully about faith and science. And I think for Catholics, we're pretty comfortable saying that there's ultimately harmony between faith and science.
Right.
People are pretty comfortable saying that they're compatible.
Right.
However, when you actually get into the work of reconciling faith and science and you get down into some of the details, it becomes very tricky. And so I was wondering if you could maybe identify, what do you think are some of the most common pitfalls that you see Catholics falling into, or anybody when they're trying to reconcile how faith and science might work together?
Well, I think the pitfall is to really think there's a fundamental conflict that needs to be reconciled. So there are issues that arise that are subtle and difficult to think through, but fundamentally there's not really a conflict between faith and science. So there's no need to reconcile, because you reconcile after a conflict. And so, but I think one of the reasons that people have the impression there's a conflict, or there's several reasons they think there's a conflict. And one of the reasons has to do with a faulty way of thinking about the relation between God and nature. So many people think that God and nature are sort of competing explanations. They're in competition with each other. So that if something has a natural explanation, then God has nothing to do with it. You don't need God because you have a natural explanation. On the other hand, if God is the explanation of the cause of something, then it's supernatural. And they set it up that way, and that's really utterly alien to the traditional Christian and Catholic understanding, which is that nature is not something over and apart from God. Nature is God's creation. God is the author of nature. Nature is to God in some way analogous to a work of music to the composer, or a novel to the novelist. And so the evidence, they're not fighting with each other. They're not competing with each other as explanations. And I think that failure to grasp that is really at the heart of a lot of the misperception of a conflict. And related to that is the failure to understand something called, the idea of secondary and primary causality, which I think is a fundamental set of concepts, which because people have lost sight of it, has contributed to this idea of conflict. I could talk about that.
Yeah, could you explain a little bit?
Yeah, so again, it goes to this analogy I used of God as the author of the universe, as the way the novelist is the author of the novel. So you could ask, what is the cause of some event in the novel? I sometimes use Hamlet, or let's use The Hobbit. So in The Hobbit, one event that happens is that this dragon Smaug dies. And you say, what is the cause of that? Well, the cause within the novel is that a character named Barr, the bowman, shoots the dragon with an arrow and kills him. So you could say the cause of the dragon's death is being shot by Barr the bowman. But you could equally say the reason why the dragon dies is because Tolkien wrote the book that way. There's another level of causality where Tolkien is the cause of the entire novel. and everything that goes on in the novel. So he also is the cause, in a sense, of the dragon dying. And those aren't competing. You don't have to choose one or the other. They're both true. And it's the same with nature and God. So if I say, does this event in the natural world, what is the cause within the plot of the natural world? That's what scientists study. How one event in the plot of the world, of the universe, causes another event in the plot of the universe. But God is the cause of it all. He's the reason there is a universe. He's the reason for everything that existing and having the relationships among themselves that they do. And so he's the primary cause. The causes scientists study are called secondary causes. And they're not competing. And because people fail to grasp this, they think there is a competition. You have to choose between God and nature. You have to pick one or the other. So if you're a scientist or scientifically minded, then you have to leave God. You have to push God out of the picture.
So if you just listen to popular discourse about science and God being mentioned anywhere together in the same paragraph, you tend to get this impression that there's something that's intrinsically inherent within science that tends to be at conflict with faith. And maybe this is because of scientists as a demographic. Do you think scientists as a group tend to be less interested in God? Is that true? And if so, is there anything that you think is maybe intrinsic in this relationship?
A couple of points I'd make about that. First of all, up until relatively recent times, historically speaking, most scientists were religious. So up until maybe the mid-19th century, almost all the great scientists were themselves believing Christians. So it is certainly true that unbelief, agnosticism, atheism has grown within the scientific world over the last 150 years or so, but it's also grown in the wider society. I'm not sure that is specifically something to do with science. I think you'll find as much atheism, say, in a university English department as you will in a university physics department. I think it's a wider cultural phenomenon. There are certain reasons why some scientists have difficulty with religion. Part of that is bad history, because the idea has grown up that science and religion have always been at war with each other for the last 400 plus years. And the Galileo episode certainly helps frame that narrative, as does the fact that many fundamentalist Christians attack evolution. So they say, well, see, the church attacked Galileo, and now we have all these Christians attacking evolution. And they fall for this story that there's always been this warfare, which sort of primes many people who go into science, prejudices them already against religion, because they think religion has been historically hostile to science. So that sets them up to have certain attitudes about religion. So that's part of it. And then there are specific questions. I mean, there are tricky questions. The biblical narrative, in times past, in ages past, some things were read literally in a rather naive way in the Bible, that now is sort of plain to us were not meant to be read literally. They had more symbolic meanings. In fact, in the early church, many great theologians read those things in a symbolic way. But they look and they say, well, you see, look at the book of Genesis says the universe is 6,000 or 10,000 or whatever years old, and now we know it's 14 billion years old. And so there are these issues that tend to, again, prejudice them towards the idea that religion is sort of a primitive, superstitious or primitive way of looking at the world. And so there are many factors like that. But I'm not sure, first of all, many scientists continue to be religious, including very eminent ones, and including Nobel Prize winners in various fields of science. And as I said, up until 150 years ago, almost all scientists were religious. So I'm not sure there's anything in science itself that's causing this atheism or unbelief. As I say, it's generally speaking a wider social phenomenon than the other causes, I think. Many scientists were atheists before they went into science. Many of the scientists you hear were very vocal atheists. Hawking, for example, or the late Stephen Hawking, or the late Stephen Weinberg, or Neil deGrasse Tyson, and so on. I'm sure they were atheists when they were children. I'm sure they were atheists long before they learned any science. And so we shouldn't think that we find an atheist who's a scientist, that his science showed him that there's no God.
So then, kind of to drill a little deeper on this question. So if it's science can't demonstrate, there's no scientific proof that would disprove the existence of God. Well, it's not the science then. What is it that's...
Well, I said they're the historical myths. Some scientists have difficulty believing in miracles, for example. And that, I can understand that as a physicist, why that would cause some people difficulties. I think it's not one reason. It's a sort of a whole set of factors and different people are unbelievers for different reasons. But
these are not scientific reasons.
No,
these
I don't think they're really scientific.
Theological, philosophical.
They're more
reasons.
philosophical. I mean, take for example Stephen Weinberg, who was a very great physicist. He was a Nobel Prize winner in my field, probably the most eminent person in my field. Now, he was an atheist. He's always an atheist. He didn't lose his faith. He was, I'm sure, an atheist as a child. But when push came to shove, when he was arguing against God, for him the big argument, nothing to do with science. It was the problem of suffering and evil in the world. Why, if there's a God, why is there suffering and evil? Well, that's a problem that goes back 2,000, like the book of Job at the very least. It goes back millennia, long before science existed. And science in no way makes that a more difficult question to answer. And so, you see, it's simplistic. One of the problems is we hear more up until recently from atheist scientists. They've been more vocal. And so people get the impression that the scientific world is devoid of faith, that it's a sort of religious wasteland and it's just filled with atheists and agnostics. That's simply not the case. There are a lot of scientists who are religious. As I said, the Society of Catholic Scientists, in 6 years, we've grown to 1,700 members. I'm sure we could grow much, much bigger if more people heard about us. And some very top people. That one of the greatest figures in the field of theoretical particle physics, Juan Maldacena, is at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He's probably, if you asked people in my field who are the top 3 scientists in the field, Maldacena would be among them. He's a practicing Catholic. So people should... Part of the problem is that people put scientists on a pedestal. And this maybe goes back to Einstein, because Einstein was maybe one of the first scientists who began to be looked up to by the public as not just a scientist, but a sage. So what he had to say about war and peace, or and other philosophical questions, Einstein said this because he was the smartest man in the world, and therefore we should listen to him on philosophical and social and political questions. And there is this tradition of certain scientists being held up as sages. Hawking sort of fell into this pattern in later years. Hawking says, it's almost, thus spake the Lord, But scientists actually, as you know, as a scientist, what makes scientists good scientists by and large is that they have certain technical skills that most people lack. Being able to solve differential equations or being good at a certain kinds of laboratory work or certain kinds of mathematical work no more makes you wise or philosophically deep than being able to play a great game of chess, or for that matter, being an NFL football player. It's a technical skill that some people have, and we shouldn't look to scientists for the meaning of life or the answer to the big questions of life.
One of the questions that comes up when talking about God's relationship to nature and challenges to faith that sometimes arise. Again, these are difficulties. They're interesting problems to think about. They're not necessarily obstacles. Mm-hmm. One of them is randomness, and this idea of randomness, that there appears to be some sort of randomness, and you talked about this a little bit today in your convocation, and probabilities kind of built into the universe. Mm-hmm. Does this present a conflict with the idea of God's providence and guidance over everything.
No, and it's an interesting thing. This generally comes up when discussing evolution. And people get bent out of shape when they hear that, according to evolutionary biologists, evolution is sort of fueled by random genetic mutations. And they get all up in arms about this. You're saying things are random. That means God is not in control of what's going on. And it's kind of interesting. I think when people think about evolution or other faith science questions, they sometimes lose their bearings. They sort of lose their common sense. We talk about randomness all the time in everyday life. And if you say, or chance, or probabilities. So if somebody's playing a game of poker and they say they had bad luck, or, what are the odds of getting dealt a straight flush or something? No one thinks that's atheistic. Or you say, if I said the molecules in the air here move around randomly, there's some randomness there. No, or if one of those lotteries with a little ping pong ball comes up with a number and you say these are 4 randomly selected numbers to determine who wins the lottery, does people think that this is atheism? No, because we know that there's chance, there's randomness, there's probabilities in everyday life. And it's only when it's somehow applied to evolution that people suddenly think this is atheism. But the question of whether there is chance in the world, people have always known that there are chance events, that there's something called chance. St. Augustine talks about it, St. Thomas Aquinas. And people have asked themselves for millennia, how does that fit in with a God who knows everything from all eternity? And there's even a chapter in one of St. Thomas Aquinas' in his Summa Contra Gentiles. I believe it is book 3, chapter 74, but I may be wrong. And the title of it is that chance and fortune are not inconsistent with divine providence. So people have wondered about that. And so this, long before modern science, St. Thomas Aquinas writing about this says, yes, there's such a thing as chance, there's such a thing as fortune, in the sense of chance, accident. But that is not incompatible with God's providence. I think people understand, if someone's gotten a traffic accident, people understand that there's some chance going on there. There's some randomness, a random shooting. People use that all the time. No one thinks that implies atheism. So I think people should, from God's point of view, of course, everything is known. Maybe this is what upsets people. If something is random, then from within the world, as it were, we can't predict what's going to happen. If I roll the dice, I can't predict what's going to happen. And so there's a sense in which random things are unpredictable. But God doesn't predict anyway. To think of God predicting the future is not Christian. It's heretical, actually, because to God, there's no past or future. God knows all things. What to us is the future, God has known from all eternity. He's the Alpha and the Omega. What to us lies in the past, God knows from all eternity. What lies for us is in the future, God knows from all eternity. He doesn't have to guess or predict. He knows in advance. He knows in one eternal, timeless act of knowing all things. And so I don't think there's a problem there. People need to, I think a good thing for people to do is if they think back off from the heated subject like evolution and just ask yourself the analogous questions from everyday life. Do we say if our Aunt Millie dies of cancer, and suppose she has a disease and I pray and she recovers, I can both believe that she recovered through some natural causes, such as a medicine she was given, and I can also believe that it was an answer to a prayer. In everyday, I think ordinary people understand that when they pray for something and God grants their prayer, that it doesn't necessarily mean there was a supernatural intervention violating the laws of nature. It's something that might happen totally in accordance with the laws of nature and yet also be an answer to prayer. And so I think ordinary people, if you get it out of the faith versus science and just think about it in everyday terms, you often see that these are non-issues.
If we're thinking about how God is interacting with the natural world, and acting normally through these secondary causes, through his providence. But we do still believe in miracles.
Right.
One of the explanatory systems or attempts to answer or describe God's relationship to nature is intelligent design. And if you maybe at the face value of it, it seems plausible because we believe that God is the supreme intelligence and that he did design the universe.
Right.
So why would anybody have a problem with intelligent design?
Right.
So you've written very eloquently about this. Could you tell us a little bit about what you see as some of the problems within intelligent design as an explanatory system?
Okay, well, first of all, in the broader sense, if intelligent design only meant that God is intelligent and designed the universe, then we all are intelligent design in that broad sense. But the intelligent design movement, capital I, capital D, is a specific movement making specific claims. And their big claim is that Darwinian evolution, the current theories of evolution are either false or very inadequate. And they disclaim, they don't say that the intelligent designer is God, but everyone understands that that's what they mean. And that in particular, there are certain biological structures that are so complex, parts of animals or processes that go on in living things that are so complex that they couldn't have arisen naturally. It would be highly improbable, and therefore God must have stepped into nature and intervened in a very special, almost miraculous way to do these things. So they're making strong claims about science, and that certain scientific theories are false. And Catholics don't have to believe that. We're not called upon to reject Darwinian evolution as Catholics. I think my big complaint about them, well, first of all, they can't really prove what they're claiming. They claim more than they're able to prove. But I think the big problem with them is at the strategic level. I feel that they're making people think about things in the wrong way. They're looking for God in violation, in things that are in things that go beyond the natural order and that are inexplicable scientifically. And that's, again, back to the nature versus God mistake. That you have, somehow nature is going along by itself without God being involved, even though God, as it were, wrote the book of nature, as it were. God's the author. Everything, my picking up this cup, God, that's part of the plot of the universe because God wrote it into the plot. God is the cause of all. He's the cause of everything that exists. But they say it's God or nature. And so where do they look for God? They look for God in places where natural explanations fail, or where, in fact, there are maybe violations of the laws of nature, miracles, or things like that. That's not the traditional Christian view. If you go back to, say, early Christian writings, the way the early church fathers argued for the existence of a creator God when they were talking to their pagan contemporaries was not to point to miracles. It was to point to the orderliness and lawfulness of nature. They said nature is God's handiwork. Look how beautiful it is. Look how harmonious. Look how lawful. Look how orderly. This requires an author. They didn't point to departures from the order of nature, but to the order of nature itself. And I can give you countless quotes. St. Irenaeus said, God is the Father, the author, the creator, the giver of order. So it was the lawfulness of nature that pointed to God. Yes, but because God, Christians historically, it wasn't that they believed in God because of miracles. They believe, I think many Catholics, we believe in miracles because we believe in God. If I didn't believe in God, I wouldn't believe in miracles. But because I do believe in God, who gave laws to nature, nature has laws because God, the lawgiver, ordained these laws. And if he gave the laws, he can suspend them. And so it's because God is the lawgiver that he has the power to have something happen that is not in accordance with the ordinary course of nature. If there were no God, I would have trouble believing in miracles. But because I believe in God, I have much easier time believing in miracles. So miracles were never the argument. And Jesus didn't perform miracles to convince. He wasn't surrounded by hordes of scientific atheists and he turning water into wine to convince the atheist. Everyone practically who witnessed Christ's miracles was a devout Jew who believed in God and also believed in miracles. That wasn't the role historically of miracles in salvation history, to prove God's existence. That wasn't what they were for. And people who lean, I think the intelligent design movement is essentially playing the atheist's game. They're conceding a huge point already, right off the bat, that you find God in places where science doesn't work. Well, that's what the atheists think, that science explains everything, and that religion is a way of filling in the gaps, in our scientific understanding, and eventually we'll see how superfluous it is because science will understand everything. That's not the reason we believe in God. We believe in God. The more the world is shown to be orderly and lawful, the more I believe in God.
So with that, we look at the natural world, we look at the order in nature, and this can, as you see in the New Testament and Romans and other places, that we see through the created order evidence for God's action and for God's existence. Yet, at the same time, you see, if you look around at like the new atheists, they're trying to do something similar in that they're taking physical data, usually scientific data, and constructing a sort of syllogism where they'll start with physical premises and end with some sort of theological conclusion.
Right.
So this sort of leads into, how should we think about when we look at the physical world, we look at nature, does it point to certain things that are immaterial? Does the physical lead us to the metaphysical? If so, is this just a case of, in some cases, misreading it, or is it sort of category mistakes?
Well, both. I mean, so one thing that scientific atheists, people who are atheists because they think science points in that direction, they will often say that, well, take the example we were just talking about, miracles. They'll say miracles are impossible. And that's a philosophical assertion. It's not a scientific assertion. What they're really saying is there are laws of nature, and there's a lot of evidence we know a lot about the laws of nature. Certain things, if these laws are in operation, if they're being obeyed, then certain things cannot happen. And so if certain laws of physics are being followed, then water doesn't turn into wine, and you can't multiply loaves and fishes, and therefore say these things didn't happen. But there's philosophical assumptions there. As I said, if you start with the premise that nature is all there is, and you may conclude that the laws of nature have some absolute validity, like the laws of arithmetic, and they can't be violated. That you can no more violate the law of conservation of energy than you can violate the 2 + 2 = 4. But if you believe, well, first of all, that's a category mistake. The laws of nature are not like the laws of arithmetic. The laws of arithmetic have to be what they are. The laws of nature could have been otherwise. We know that's why we have to go out and look and find out what they are. If they had to be what they are, we could sit in a chair and figure out what the laws of nature are just by sitting here, the way we could sit here and discover mathematical truths without leaving our couch. But the laws of physics are not absolute and necessary like that. They happen to hold, and we believe as Christians that they hold because God made those the laws of nature. In which case, it's not impossible. Miracles are not impossible. So there's a philosophical arguments and reasoning that goes into these things that they think are just simply scientific conclusions, but they're not. They're really philosophical presuppositions going into them. But there are scientific discoveries that can create problems theologically. For example, and I talked about this today, for hundreds of years, since Newton in the late 1600s, for over 200 years, all the evidence seemed to point to the laws of physics being so rigidly controlling everything that happens in the world, that it was difficult to see how humans could act freely, because everything that I do would be uniquely controlled by these equations, and I couldn't. And then in the ninth, and that is a sign. Now, it was an extrapolation from what was known, but it was a pretty reasonable seeming extrapolation. The laws of physics had this rigid determinism, as it was called, and that does create a problem for human freedom, which is then a theological problem. But then in the 20th century, it was discovered that the laws of physics don't rigidly control everything in that way, and what's called physical determinism was overthrown, and that removed a big obstacle to belief in free will. So there are times when scientific findings lend themselves to certain interpretations which can be in tension with theological, with religious doctrines. That can happen. It doesn't happen very often. And when it happens, usually if you wait long enough, you find out that the things that seem to be in conflict, that the science changes, or people realize that that their theological ideas were wrong, inadequate. But that can happen. But in many cases, as you say, it's really not science and theology. It's philosophical assumptions people are tacitly making, sometimes without even being aware that they're making them, that are creating the problems.
For my last question, I want to ask you maybe a somewhat more personal question. So as Catholic Christians, we believe that Jesus is that which explains everything. He's the golden key, right, to kind of quote Kreeft and George MacDonald's reference there. So for you personally, when you think about Jesus and taking on human nature and this kind of theological relationship in your own life, how has your science maybe affected or informed the ways you think about how Christ interacts with you and with the world?
Well, it doesn't actually, my science doesn't affect how I think directly about Jesus of Nazareth and his human nature, but it does affect how I think about his divine nature, because Jesus is the Logos. He is the Word made flesh. And, the word Logos means both word and reason. And so the Gospel of John could be read, in the beginning was reason, and reason was with God, and reason was God. And that is a legitimate reading of that. And the Church Fathers interpreted the word Logos also to mean reason. So what I see as a physicist, physics is very impersonal. It's not dealing with love, and human relationships. We're dealing with electrons and quarks and nuclei and things. It's very impersonal. But what I do see in physics, I don't learn anything about love. I don't learn anything about, but I do learn something about God's wisdom, which is, I do learn, I get a glimpse of the beauty of God's creation, and an appreciation of the Logos, of the rationality of the world and how that reflects upon the divine reason. And I make my own the prayer of Johannes Kepler, the great Lutheran scientist 400 years ago, who said, "I thank thee, Lord God, our Creator, that thou hast allowed me to see the beauty in thy work of creation." As a physicist, I'm privileged to see, and I think that many people in various fields have unique perspectives on things that other people don't. And when you're seeing things at a very fundamental level in physics, you get to see the inner workings of the physical world, and you glimpse something of God's majesty there that other people are not privileged to be able to see. And so it affects my view of God. But at a somewhat abstract level, I have to say, so that's why I say it affects my view of Jesus as God, but the human dimension of things, not so much.
Well, thank you. It's been fascinating, another enlightening conversation, and thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.